Hello and welcome to the first episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication of avocados, alongside their history and the pedigree of many cultivars of avocado as well. Now on to the archaeology of avocado. Avocado has been used since ancient times in Mesoamerica and the northern parts of South America. Within that time span, this plant gained spiritual importance as well. Artifacts found in sites that were once home to different tribes of Mesoamerican natives and northern South American natives have artifacts that depict avocados. It also appears in Mayan iconography in different periods. In fact, in the Mayan calendar, the 14th month has a glyph that depicts an avocado. Trees were very important in Mayan culture because it's believed that when a human dies, they become reborn as a tree. As such, most grave sites have small gardens that are tended by groundskeepers or by the family itself, who believe that the tree is their loved ones reborn. Due to this tree being depicted in Mayan artifacts, it is likely that the avocado was domesticated prior to the making of that calendar. Now on to the genetic origins of avocado. It is difficult to track the domestication of avocados because in the Mesoamerican areas, they use a forest garden agriculture system. A forest garden agriculture system is basically where they modify the forest to make it more suitable for intensive fruit production, although not as intensive as is found in a common orchard. But various studies have been documented to figure out the origins and domestication of this species. Within the domesticated forms, there is 3 recognized land races of avocado: the Mexican avocado, the Guatemalan avocado, and the West Indian avocado. All 3 land races show high amounts of pollen movement between these 3 populations, and even with hybrids removed, there was very little genetic difference between the land races, indicating that the land races were recently bred or there was hybridization recently that showed up. Further research indicated that the domesticated avocado retains 80% or 90%, depending on the study, of its genetic diversity. In this case, they do not show. There also seems to be evidence of multiple domestication events, as well as frequent backcrossings into the wild populations, and hybridizations between the independent domesticated populations. For this reason, 2 researchers, Dr. Gama Campello and Dr. Gomez Pampa, believe that this tree is only semi-domesticated, since wild trees are still being planted in gardens, and domesticated forms are being planted in the wild. A further genetic study by Galandel Tover et al. In 2007 seems to suggest that avocado was domesticated at least twice, once in Mexico and once in Central America. Now on to the origins of modern cultivars. Now on to the cultivars and their pedigrees. A research paper by the University of California analyzed many modern cultivars of avocado to see their origins and their pedigrees. Here are the results of their study. We will cover the cultivars of many different varieties of avocado. The cultivars Anaheim Andes 3 and Andes 4 were bred from Guatemalan stock. carrying 99 to 95% of their genome from that landrace population. The Aru cultivar has 99% of its gene pool from the West Indies landrace. The cultivar Bacon has 94% of its genome coming from the Guatemalan landrace population. The cultivar Duke 7 has 99% of its genetics from the Mexican land races. Duke 6 has 100% of its genome from the Mexican land race. Esther, Futur, Ganter, and Gwen are derived almost entirely from Guatemalan land races, Mexican land races, and Guatemalan land races, respectively. Now onto some hybrid genomes. H287 is a crossbreed between the Mexican and Guatemalan land races, as is H670 and Haas. These cultivars have 57% Mexican landrace DNA, 43% Guatemalan DNA, 50-50 on each, and 42% Mexican landrace, and 58% Guatemalan landrace, respectively. And it pretty much goes on like this. Most of the hybrids and modern cultivars of avocado are bred from the Guatemalan landrace, the Mexican landrace, or are complex hybrids between both. So when you have an avocado, its pedigree is probably Mexican or Guatemalan. That ends the video on avocados. Stay tuned for the next episode on bananas. See you then. Hello and welcome to Agri History, Tropical Edition Episode 2. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication of bananas, or Musa spp. SPP, by the way, indicates species, because many species are used in the breeding of banana. The two species used in banana breeding include Musa acuminata, or the A type, and Musa balbacinea, or the B type. The A type species has the widest range of the two species, also dwelling mostly in islands as well. The B types, found in low-lying areas, seem to be semi-domesticated forms of banana as well. Both species can crossbreed to produce sterile hybrids that are easily propagated. In fact, many of our bananas today are of such origin. In the wild, the A type seems to have been domesticated multiple times in multiple countries, such as New Guinea, the Malayan Peninsula, and Southeast India, as well as some from Java. The pure-blooded A cultivars seem to show a mixture of two subspecies of the A species. It is also likely that within the native range of the B-type species, that there's pure-blooded B cultivars of B-type banana. The early hybrids between the A and B types may have started in India through crossbreeding of the edible type A cultivars with the wild B species to produce AB cultivars. The hybridization process of crossbreeding A types and B types together also created unstable meiosis. This created possible progeny of triploid and tetraploid types, with a wide array of variation in the progeny, such as a triploid of pure A type DNA, labeled AAA, a triploid with 2 sets of chromosomes from the A type and 1 set from the B type, and another group of cultivars that have 2 sets of chromosomes from the B type and 1 set from the A type. An AAB cultivar group found in eastern Indonesia seem to have generated 2 types of plantain banana, including the Pacific plantains and the African plantain, of which may have crossbred with native species of A-type banana to produce their famous triple A-type banana, called the Highland-type bananas. More triploids would likely be bred in India and the Philippines. At later dates, the Arabian folk would later transfer these plants across the Asian and African world as part of a trade route, allowing for further mixing of all these varieties. Amongst the AAA cultivars are included the Gros Michel banana and its successor, the Cavendish banana, which is the banana sold in supermarkets today. The sweet acid bananas are of the AAB group, and we'll discuss these later, and plantains seem to be a mix of the AAA varieties and the AAB varieties. The main banana variety that was used for trading purposes for the longest time was Gros Michel from 1830 to the late 1950s. This was because of its high yield and bruise-resistant peel and the ability to store for long periods of time for shipping purposes. Later on, a disease called Fusarium wilt began wiping out huge swaths of that population of banana. And since bananas are primarily bred through cloning, i.e. divisions and cuttings, when the fungus began infecting one plant of Gros Michel, the entire population was revealed to be susceptible. And as such, when they found the Cavendish banana, a half-sibling of Gros Michel, with resistance to Fusarium wilt, the banana traders decided to test it out to see if it would store and do all the things Gros Michel did. And it worked, and became the most widely used banana in international trade. Now onto the sugar acid type bananas. These type of bananas are also referred to as apple bananas, because these bananas have a flavor similar to apple. Apple bananas are an umbrella term for many different types of bananas, such as the silk group of bananas, as well as the palm group of bananas. But also included within this group are the Mysore banana and the Nepovane banana. Hopefully I'm pronouncing these names correctly. Well, that covers everything. I hope to see you on the next episode of Agri History Tropical Edition. Stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to Agri History. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication and history of citrus. We'll start by talking about the domestication of the base plants that are the main parents for all future citrus varieties, i.e. the mandarin and the pomelo, followed by the creation and development of all the new hybrid citruses such as lemon and lime and grapefruit, alongside what admixture occurs during the domestication events. Admixture being a hybridization event happening, and that hybrid being frequently backcrossed into one of its parents until it's only got a partial amount of the second parent's DNA. And finally, we'll talk the history of citrus. So let's get into it. First, you'll cover the mandarin. The mandarin is one of the very few pure species that act as not just a fruit crop itself, but a parent for many other citrus varieties. The mandarin is native to the mountains of South China, primarily in Yunnan province and Jiangxi province, as well as the Hezhou region. All names I probably butchered, unfortunately. This region likewise has a long history of mandarin cultivation. Recent genetic studies have shown that there's two distinct groups of mandarin, and both these groups were derived from independent domestication events. The first group, labeled the MD1 group, called the MD1 group, is found north of the Nanling Mountains. This group includes cultivars such as the sour mandarin and the red tangerine, as well as the Changsha mandarin. The MD2 group include the Hezhou wild mandarin and low-acid land races of mandarin. Now, cultivars of citrus, including mandarin, are easy to reproduce, because many citrus species and hybrids undergo a process called apomixis, which is a process where a plant converts a stem cell into an embryo within a plant. This is something that will be covered further in greater detail in other videos. but this phenomenon will be important for the rest of this video, so keep this in your back pocket. You'll come back to it later. Now we will cover the domestication of the pomelo, as well as admixture in mandarins and the creation of the orange. First, let's cover the admixture. Within the populations of mandarin, several wild mandarin specimens, usually from the Guiaxi Mountains, which border the area where pomelos grow, and as such, there have been some specimens, both in domesticated populations where pomelos and mandarins grow together, as well as wild populations where there's overlap between the two populations that have admixture between pomelo and mandarin. The estimated level of this hybridization within these populations is a hybridization percentage of 1.48. Indicating a small amount, 1.48% of the DNA in certain populations of mandarin have 1.48% pomelo DNA. The domesticated pomelo was bred from the wild pomelo 100,000 to 300,000 years ago. The sour orange, which is one type of orange, is itself a crossbreed between both a pomelo and a pure-blooded mandarin of some sort. The sweet orange seems to be a hybrid between a mandarin with a little bit of pomelo DNA mixed in via admixture and a regular pomelo, with all new varieties of orange being sports of an orange. Now onto the origins of many other species of citrus that are brought into existence through hybridization. The first is a crossbreed between a pomelo and a sweet orange. This crossbreed is commonly known as a grapefruit. This hybridization event occurred in the Caribbean, probably on the Barbados Islands. The lemon seems to be a hybrid between a citron, a wild species of citrus, and a sour orange, which in itself is a hybrid between a mandarin and a pomelo. The sweet lime is a hybrid between a lemon and a citron. The citron itself is used extensively in religious ceremonies in India, and there are many other types of citrus that are bred using the citron. The bergamot plant and the Volcamar lemon as well were also hybrids between a citron and a sour orange. The Rangpur lime and the wrinkled lemon are both hybrids between a mandarin and a citron. The sweet lime of Palestine is a crossbreed between a citron and a sweet orange, and many other limes are hybrids between a citron and a species known as Citrus micrantha. Now onto the history of citrus. In terms of history, the earliest known mention of citrus was written 4,000 years ago in a Chinese book called Yu Gong. It is also mentioned that during the reign of Emperor Da Yu in the 21st century BC, that this king obtained a tribute of many different types of citrus, some small and some large, probably pomelo and mandarins. In later years, in 304 Common Era, a book titled The Southeast Region of China mentioned the citron as a food that's eaten with honey, alongside sweet orange and various types of mandarin. They also mention a strange form of lemon that's flat. In later years, in the year 1178 CE, the book's collection called Ju Lu, in its collection, 27 types of citrus were listed, alongside cultivation techniques and disease and pest control. In India, many references to citrus can be found in Sanskrit books that date back to 800 BC. These books often mention different types of citrus, including citron and lemon. During the invasion of Strapi of Media by Alexander the Great, he obtained the citron, naming it the apple of Media, and introduced it to Greece. Theophrastus of Erso, a contemporary of Alexander the Great, mentioned that the citron was not edible, but could be used in medicine and as mouthwash. We do not know, however, if the Romans had citrus. As Islamism consolidated its power, citrus fruit spread throughout Europe as part of the trade routes they had made. The sour orange would have arrived from the east from the trade routes in Egypt, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula, as well as Sicily, Italy. In this time period, the first known use of the word lemon was also found. The term lemon was coined by Basil of Toledo in his 11th century book called the Book of Agriculture. The pomelo was also brought to Europe in the 11th century, but did not succeed in growing there. During this time, these were mostly used for medicinal purposes and not for eating. But later on, with the introduction of the sweet orange, this all changed. This started in the 16th century in Portugal. These citrus later arrived in the New World via Christopher Columbus in 1493, and later on the strange fruit known as the forbidden fruit by Griffith Hughes was found in the 1700s, and in 1837 was renamed the grapefruit. And at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, the citrus became a symbol of wealth. At the end of the 18th and in the early 19th century, the production of citrus became a market-oriented activity. From its introduction to California in 1875 to now, the navel orange has been a main staple in citrus production in the United States. Well, that's about all. Stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to another episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the origins of coconut, as well as its history and domestication. First, you'll cover its early history in prehistoric texts and lore. In South and Southeast Asia, especially Sri Lanka and India, various historical texts show that the coconut plays a very important part in the culture of these societies, including traditions and religions, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. Hindu and Buddhist texts are filled with metaphors, symbolisms, and many references to the coconut. And prior to being written down, these Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, especially the Hindu ones which were written 3,000 years ago, would have been carried along through oral tradition. This seems to be paralleled in the Australasian islands like Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia in these native cultures. Now on to a litany of different studies that talk about the origins and history of this species. There have been very few studies on the origins of coconut, but amongst the hypotheses made, several stand out as very possible origin points of the coconut. Dr. Ken Dole modified his 1882 hypotheses of the origin of the coconut. He changed it from the South American areas to the Indian archipelago. His prior hypothesis was due to the fact that most of the close relatives of the coconut are found in South America. Dr. Kendall arrived at his new decision because of his experience of Hindu culture, which had a long history of coconut use. Dr. Cook remained a supporter of the South American hypothesis, again due to the fact that most of the wild relatives of coconut are found in South America. Although during that time there was speculation of pre-Columbian trade between the Americas and the East Asians, although no archaeological evidence has yet appeared. Dr. Bakari came up with the hypothesis that the coconut is African in origin due to many of the wild relatives of the coconut being also found in Africa. As such, there's wild relatives of coconut found both in Africa and South America. Dr. Fapar suggested yet another hypothesis that coconuts are not domesticated, but are in fact wild and native to many regions, and some populations are semi-domesticated. Dr. Child suggested that the Old World is the best option for the origin of the coconut, but further suggested that due to the movement of coconut through the ocean, it is unlikely we will ever know the exact origin of the species. Dr. Pursglove found that most of the pests of coconut Melanesia, and from there, he speculated that the coconut may have evolved there, although this hypothesis was disproven by later authors. Dr. Whitehead later on proposed the origin of the coconut to be some island off of Sri Lanka or India, or an extinct island in that similar area. He likewise endorsed the idea that the coconut evolved from the species Jubaropsis cafra, which came from Africa. During these studies, many fossils of both nuts, pollen, and remains have been dated. The oldest sample we have is fossilized pollen from 8600 BP. This pollen was found on the Cook's Islands, known as Attio and Mangia. As of yet, we do not know the immediate progenitor of the species, and in fact, the species may have gone extinct a long time ago. Although the coconut is closely related to Coco lutefolia, although we do not know if this is the progenitor species or not. Now time to finish this episode up. Of the studies mentioned, some have been disproved and some have been somewhat vindicated. For instance, Dr. Swar was correct that these species were semi-domesticated, due to the fact that, through genetic studies, these plants still show a lot of wild character traits, including in yield. There's also been a study that suggests that there's been heavy selection for an increased size of the nut. Unfortunately, coconut is not the usual domesticated crop because this crop is used for multiple purposes, and as such, higher yield in one specific plant part was not selected for, but rather an overall change in the increase of plant parts. And different cultures had different desires for what the coconut is used for. India, for instance, preferred smaller sized coconuts for making ball copra. The Pacific Islanders seem to have selected for higher volumes of coconut water, and the Maldives seem to have selected for larger fruit and more nuts. It appears that there's different selective variables depending on the region of the world it was selected from. Well, that about covers everything. Stay tuned for the next episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. Hope to see you then. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication of date palm, more commonly known as dates. In this episode, we'll cover some of the natural history of dates, its domestication, and some of the cultural history of dates. First, let's talk about the natural history of dates. As of yet, no confirmed wild populations have been described in terms of the date species. The name of the species of date is Phoenica dactyus. Uncultivated forms of the species have been found across Africa and the Middle East, where they've been used for millennia, but we do not know if they are of hybrid origin, feral plants, or truly wild forms of this date species. Charred remains of the species, however, have been found that date between the year 6000 BC and 501 BC. although this evidence only provides weak evidence of cultivation. The comparatively large amount of archaeological data found in the Oman Peninsula, which we'll cover later, seem to indicate that this species was probably domesticated in the Arabian Peninsula. As of yet, due to the lack of an ability to distinguish a wild specimen from a domesticated specimen of date, the researchers cannot pin down a specific location for its origins. There are several speculated origins of this species, one of which is called the hybrid origin of the date palm. Phoenix dactifera can freely hybridize between many different species of wild date, such as Phoenix sylvestris and Phoenix canarius and Phoenix reticulianta. Since the common date is interfertile with all these species, it is possible that the common date was domesticated from one of these species or was made from a hybrid of one or more of these species. This hypothesis was later disproven by genetic evidence. This suggests that the date palm was actually domesticated from a wild form of Phoenix dactifera, but it's unknown if the original populations of wild dates still exists. Due to the frequent crossbreed between both wild and domesticated forms, there may be no pure ancestral forms left. Now on to the domestication of this plant. After the domestication of the Middle Eastern strains of date palm, there appears to be a secondary domestication event that happened in Africa. Several cultivars and strains have been studied genetically, and there is a high genetic diversity within this population. In fact, the genetic differences between the African and Middle Eastern strains of date are greater than differences between the Middle Eastern strains of date and the wild strains of date. The genetic difference between the Middle Eastern and African date strains is 22.92%. The genetic differences between the wild strain and the Middle Eastern strains is 16.45%. As such, there seems to be distinct populations of African and Middle Eastern dates, and there's some evidence of occasional gene flow between the two groups, such as was seen in the Egyptian cultivar Siwi. Based on the current genetic evidence, there seems to be some crossbreeding between another species of phoenix called Phoenix sylvestris and the common date. This may be the origin of this African strain of date. There's also been sightings of independent wild date palms being found in that area as well. This might have contributed to the genome of the African strains of date palm as well, although these have not been verified yet. Now on to the archaeological remains of date palm, and what information can be gleaned from these remnants. Archaeological evidence found in the Oasis Agri system in the 3rd millennium BC seems to show a transition and spread of these between the 2nd millennium BC and the Christian era. This spread occurred all across the Persian Gulf and Saharan Africa, especially in Egypt. This diffusion was not only knowledge and illustrations, but also biological materials, since thousands of cultivars of different date exist today. To figure out the origins of the date, the researchers I've referenced studied and compared the seeds of different date palms found in Egyptian sites in order to see what differences and similarities the date palms of then and the date palms of now in terms of seed shape and density, exist. They have likewise found seeds that date back to the 5th century BC in Persia and the 1st and 2nd century AD in Roman settlements and crypts. They have also found date specimens that were being grown in the Islamic period in the 8th century. Using various statistical software, as well as various computer programs that are made to analyze seed similarities, they had found greater diversity of seed size and shape in the uncultivated forms of date than the cultivated forms of date. The uncultivated forms of date being more rectangular in shape compared to the more spherical shape of the cultivated date. And these uncultivated groups were found in the Omar Peninsula. This may indicate an origin point for the domestication of dates. The archaeological evidence suggests that dates have been in domestication in Egypt since the 14th century BC, so the actual domestication event of date palm must be prior to that period, adding further evidence to the hypothesis that 6 millennia ago, the species we know as dates were domesticated. Well, that covers everything. Have a good day. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Agri History Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the natural history, domestication, and origins of mango. The mango tree, also known as Mangifera indica, is a perennial fruit tree that's been cultivated in the Indian subcontinent for over 4,000 years, where it's called the king of fruits. This timeline places the domestication of mango at the same time point as the domestication of walnut, citron, peach, orange, lemon, and jujube, and prior to the domestication of the pistachio and the cashew. Based on current genetic tests, our current mango is very closely related to multiple species such as Mangifera sylvatica, Mangifera calamura, Mangifera zelianica, and Mangifera pendentra. Mangifera indica and Mangifera sylvatica are both located in the same area in the forest bordering India and Burma, but Mangifera sylvatica has a distinct form in its fruit that's not found in any mango cultivar except for Totapari. Although the current genetic tests showcase a very close relationship between both species with only minor genetic differences. Mangoes likely started off their origin in the India-Burma region, and since domesticated mango was not found in the fossil records of any of the Pacific islands, this region must be the center of domestication as well as the center of origin. Different texts in the Sanskrit language also indicate this as a center of domestication. Similarly, the Malaysian word for mango and the South Indian word for mango are the same word. This puts the center of origin and domestication of mango in India. Now on to the distribution of mango, how it moved from place to place. After likely being domesticated in India, the most probable source of the movement of mango from India to the rest of Asia were the Buddhist monks, who traveled between India and Southeast Asia quite frequently. During the 4th and 5th century, mangoes began their westward journey when Persians acquired mangoes and spread them to Africa in the 9th and 10th centuries. In the 16th century, trade began growing quite exponentially, and new mango cultivars were introduced into Africa via the Portuguese. The Portuguese would continue to introduce mangoes to different parts of the world, such as Western Africa and Brazil in the 1700s. From those locations, mango would have been spread to the Caribbean islands of Barbados in 1742 and Jamaica in 1782. The Spanish colonies, who had control of both Mexico, parts of the Caribbean, and the Philippines during that time period, would introduce mangoes directly from the Philippines and the Caribbean to Mexico. The first mangoes arrived in Florida in 1833, and in the 20th century, Florida created a large-scale intensive breeding program to breed many new types of mango, some of which are still grown to this day, such as Tommy Atkins, the most common mango you'll find in stores, Hayden, Keat, and Kent. For this reason, South Florida has been termed a secondary center of domestication in mangoes. Now on to the origin points of wild mango. Current genetic evidence suggests that some of the genetic diversity did not come from India, and that certain Southeast Asian types of mango diverged from the wild population a lot earlier than the Indian cultivars. This may indicate that Indochina mangoes and Indian mangoes may have been domesticated independently, or that they were domesticated initially from mangoes in Indochina and further improved in India. Although some crossbreeding between wild mangoes and domesticated mangoes may be the source of this discrepancy, it is also unknown if the wild mangoes we see are feral mangoes or truly wild mangoes. It could be that the wild species of mango is extinct, but there's yet another hypothesis on the origin of mango. Cytological studies by Dr. Mukherjee in the 1950s seem to suggest that the mango is of hybrid origin, created from hybridizations between multiple species of wild mango, and as such may not exist in the wild, i.e. it was a species born from domestication, with no wild analog. Well, this concludes our video on mango domestication. Thank you for watching and stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to another episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover 3 types of millet, their domestication history. The species we'll cover will be Usseline coracana, also known as finger millet, Panicum millicum, also known as broomcorn millet, and Pennisetum glaucum, aka pearl millet. We will start with finger millet. Finger millet is a very important grain crop found in Africa and India. Within those areas, it is used to produce beer, porridge, soup, bread, and cake, as well as puddings. It is also used for making a beverage called arak, spelled A-R-A-K, an alcoholic beverage utilized in Africa and India. There is a lot of controversy when it comes to the origins of this species in terms of domestication. Dr. Ken Dole considered finger millet a crop domesticated in India due to the fact that most species of Usseline are found in the south of Asia, and less of these species are found across the rest of the world. Also the fact that there's a Sanskrit word for finger millet, but no Arabic word. He later on suggested that after being domesticated in India, it was introduced to East Africa and from there into Western Africa. Building upon this, Dr. Greenway concluded that finger millet was domesticated from the weed known as Usseline indica due to the large amount of morphological diversity within the cultivated species and the wild species. Later on, finger millet fossils were found and they were dated to around 1800 BC, although later archaeological evidence showed that this was not finger millet fossil grains, on the basis of morphological evidence. Dr. Porter's suggested that finger millet was domesticated independently from two different species, one from Africa and one from Asia. These two cultivars would eventually be hybridized together to form the current species, while Dr. Mehra suggested that it was only domesticated in Africa, and only the African species is the ancestor. Recent genetic evidence seems to have proven the latter. Now onto broomcorn millet. Broomcorn millet is amongst the oldest of the domesticated grains. There's been heavy debate on where it was domesticated. Some speculate it was domesticated in Eastern Europe, others say Northern China. And this debate is confounded even further by the finding of broomcorn millet domesticated that predates 6000 BP. These samples were found in the northeastern areas of the Yellow River Valley in northeastern China. Several researchers have developed a technique to test the land races to find out what the origin of this cultivated crop is, and comparing that genetic evidence with the hypotheses of a Eurasian origin and a Chinese origin, with new dating processes as well as genetic techniques. They have found the hypothesis of a Eurasian origin to be untenable. Some of the artifacts found in Eurasia were dated older than they actually were, and there was less diversity within the populations of broomcorn millet, was less than was found in China. This once more seems to suggest a Chinese origin of broomcorn millet. Based on the current model, the wild ancestor of broomcorn millet expanded its range at some point in the last 10,000 to 20,000 years. This was followed by an increase in use of the species by primordial people. Now, as for the actual species it was derived from, the genetic evidence seems to suggest that Penicitum capillare, or a close related species, is a wild ancestor to our broomcorn millet. Given that this species is an allopolyploid, or a species made from the crossbreeding of two other species, there is still the other species in question that's unknown. Afterwards, broomcorn millet would have spread throughout China. It would be through these different routes available to China, to Serbia, and other parts of Eurasia that would be used to trade and expand the range of domesticated broomcorn millet. Well, that covers that crop. Onto the last one, proso millet. Now on to the domestication of proso millet. Millet plants are clump-forming plants that have a wild-type dormancy but have great storage capabilities. Based on current evidence, pearl millet was probably domesticated between 2500 BC and 2000 BC in the lower Tensmi Valley in eastern Mali. Like most other grains, the traits that would be selected for would be non-shattering traits. Since the earliest known samples of non-shattering seed heads of pearl millet were found in 2000 BC, and based on the general trajectory of Neolithic time frames of domestication, it is likely that cultivation of pearl millet began at around 4000 BC. The presence of fully domesticated pearl millet were found by 1700 BC, based on pottery which contains chaff of pearl millet. From there, it is likely that pearl millet spread southward, and eventually to the east, to the most northwestern part of the subcontinent of India, in the area between Indus Valley and the Saharata Peninsula. This likely happened between 1900 BC and 1700 BC. The Indian strains have a smaller grain than the African strain, indicating a genetic divergence. This dissemination process would have gone through the regions of Niger, Chad, and finally the Sudan, if this was the case, and there's weak evidence to suggest this route. Researchers have found impressions of Pennisetum species, both with domesticated traits and wild traits. There also seems to be evidence of maritime trade between the Red and Arabian Seas. This route also explains the origins of African crops in Asia, such as sorghum and hyacinth bean, which arrived in India in ancient times. This may indicate Neolithic trading going on between Asia and Africa sometime in ancient history during the Holocene era. Well, this concludes our video on millet domestication. Thank you for watching and stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to another episode of Agri History, Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover papaya. Papaya is the third most cultivated tropical crop worldwide, with Brazil and India being the largest producers. In the wild, papayas are dioecious, having male and female flowers, while the domesticated forms are either dioecious or hermaphroditic. Some of these cultivars are inbred, resulting in stable traits throughout generations. 2/3 of the cultivars of papaya are hermaphroditic in nature. In this episode, we will cover the natural history, domestication, and a portion of the genetics of papaya. We will start with the natural history. The papaya, known by its scientific name Carica papaya, is suggested by most researchers to be a Mesoamerican species, although where in Mesoamerica or Central America it came from is still unknown. This is due to the lack of archaeological data and the difficulty identifying papaya remnants in the fossil record. Although the presence of papaya prior to the Spanish conquest of Mexico suggests a Mesoamerican origin. This is further confirmed by the fact that closely related genera to the Carica genus are found in Mesoamerica in high numbers. Also, Carica and its close related species found in Mesoamerica have a unilocular ovary in the fruit, while the South American species within the same family have 5 locular ovaries. Also, it's been found that the highest level of genetic diversity of papaya is found in southern Mexico. As such, the likely center of origin the natural range of papaya is the entirety of Mexico and parts of Central America, with the largest amount of genetic variation being found in Mexico, where it was likely domesticated. Now let's talk about domestication. The Maya were one of the biggest plant domesticators in the world, with Mexico being one of the major centers of domestication for many plants and animals. The Mayans were probably also the first to domesticate, cultivate, and trade papayas, both the fruit and the leaves, which were useful for tenderizing meat. In the 16th century, the Spaniards who conquered that area began spreading papaya beyond Mesoamerica, and from there they were introduced to the island of Hispaniola, currently known as the areas of Haiti and Santo Domingo. It is here that the fruit would gain the name papaya. Prior to that, it was known as olocoton. As it spread to the West Indian islands, such as Jamaica and Cuba, they gained new names. In Jamaica, it obtained the name pawpaw. In Cuba, it was called fruta bomba, and so on and so forth. In 1526, the papaya was taken outside of America and spread to Indonesia, and from there it spread throughout the West Indies and the rest of tropical Asia, and from there it was transferred to Africa by European colonial powers such as Portugal, Denmark, Britain, and France. The relative longevity of papaya seeds aided in this process, and as I can attest, when you plant papaya seeds, most will germinate and produce seedlings. There's been quite a bit of change from its wild ancestor to its current form. The wild papayas have taller trees and smaller fruit typically. The domesticated papaya has orange flesh, while the wild form has fruit with yellow flesh. Also, most of the domesticated forms are hermaphrodites. These were natural mutations in male plants that were selected by primordial people, likely around 4,000 years ago. Finally, there is a dormancy trait in the wild plants that are not found in the domesticated forms. The seeds of wild papaya will remain dormant if buried for long periods of time, and only germinate when there's sufficient light. In domesticated forms of papaya, this trait is lost, increasing the amount of viable seeds that can be planted. Now on to genetics. Now on to the recent discoveries of papaya genomics. Through genetic analysis, they have found that Mexico, specifically southern Mexico in the rainforest regions of Los Tuxtlas, have the highest level of genetic diversity. They have also found fragmented forest areas where domesticated and wild papaya crossbreed, creating hybrids of both forms. These plants often contain a mixture of both wild-type and domesticated-type flowers, with some plants having both male, female, and hermaphrodite flowers. They have also found that cultivated and feral papayas have a lower level of genetic diversity than wild populations. With the creation of the transgenic rainbow papaya, it is unknown if this crossbreeding between these two populations will have an adverse effect on the ecosystem as a whole in future generations. While the ability of transgenic papaya plants to be pollinated by non-transgenic plants is rare, the ability of a transgenic papaya to transfer pollen to a non-transgenic plant is high, so it may be wise to not grow transgenic papayas in areas where wild papayas still dwell. Well, that covers about everything. I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to Agri History Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication of Punica granatum, also known as the pomegranate. In this episode, we will give a brief introduction to the use and nature of the pomegranate, a brief history of its use, the centers of origin and genetic diversity, and finally domestication. Now let's start with a brief introduction. This plant has been used for millennia as a medical remedy, and it's been shown that all parts of this plant have several bioactive metabolites. It is said to have started in Iran or the Near East, and over time spread across the Old World. It was likely introduced to India and China via the Silk Road. It was in 1416 that Spanish sailors and missionaries introduced pomegranates to the New World, such as Mexico and California. This species has the unique ability to adapt to multiple climates. This plant is mentioned in the Bible, Quran, as well as Buddhist and Chinese artwork and folklore. It is also found in ancient Turkish and Greek mythologies. It is also one of the most drought-tolerant fruit crops available to people on this planet. Combined with its tolerance to tropical, subtropical, and Mediterranean climates, this plant has become a mainstay in many environments, and it's even been used as a ornamental tree in East Asia. The pomegranate is part of the family Punaceae, which contains a single genus with 2 species, Punica granatum and Punica protopunica. The latter species is found in Yemen, on Socotra Island. Punica protopunica has 14 chromosomes, while the cultivated pomegranate has 18 chromosomes. And the chromosome sizes in the cultivated form vary from variety to variety. For instance, there have been tetraploid varieties found in India. These trees have fruit and flowers that exceed the natural diploid forms by a considerable margin, and most of its pollen is sterile. Now on to a brief history of the species. Pomegranates have had a long history in many different cultures, although it's always been a minor fruit in those same countries. The first known appearance of cultivated pomegranate occurred in Sumeria between 4100 BP and 4200 BP during the Ura dynasty, although at this point Sumeria was already prospering quite well. This potentially pushes back the domestication event to 5000 BC, although there's still evidence that pomegranate was being grown in Jericho around 6000 BP, potentially pushing back that date even further. In ancient Rome, the earliest records of pomegranate cultivation occur in 1000 BC in Carthage. This civilization granted Rome seedless pomegranates from their regions. It was confirmed to be cultivated in Carthago at 900 BC, and the Pyrenean Peninsula, Greece, and Italy at 400 BC. And in the Urartu region, there was evidence of domestication and cultivation around 800 BC. The movement from that area to Transcaucasia probably began at the end of 900 BC. Within the Middle East, there was also examples of, pomegranate being propagated as well, and the varieties of domesticated pomegranate found in Central Asia are very close to those of the Middle East, indicating that the Central Asian variants of pomegranate are related to those that came from the Middle East, and these strains have greater levels of genetic diversity. It's estimated that cultivation of pomegranate in Central Asia went into full swing around 3000 BP, and since the subtropical climate of Turkmenistan around 4000 BC, it can be estimated that the cultivation of pomegranate in that area began between 3000 BC and 4000 BC. The existing evidence points to China obtaining pomegranate from the Central Asia area around 4000 BP, and pomegranates in California predate the Confederation of the United States in 1769. In ancient Greece, pomegranates were used as a symbol of the unbreakable bond of marriage. In Persian mythology, a hero ate pomegranate and became invincible. In Jewish tradition, it is said that 613 seeds are found in a pomegranate, one for each commandment in the Jewish Bible. In Buddhism, the pomegranate is one of the 3 blessed fruits. In Chinese art, the pomegranate is associated with fertility and posterity, as well as a great many family members who are of virtuous quality. The Quran describes heaven as having pomegranate trees. The Babylonians likewise believed that eating pomegranate before battle made you invincible. The crowns of Jewish kings were also based on the shape of a pomegranate. The pomegranate was also the symbol of the Roman emperor in ancient times. The words Grenada, the island nation of South America, as well as the word grenade, were both derived from the word pomegranate, and it's very possible that the first portrayals of the tree of life were either a date palm or a pomegranate. In Venice, from 1486 and onwards, the pomegranate was also used in much of the patterns in many works of art. It has also been used as a symbol for Egyptian tombs during the Bronze Age. Pliny the Elder described the use of pomegranate rind as a means of obtaining perfume, and Pliny recognized that this plant had multiple purposes, both medical and aesthetic, and it was used as both a perfume and a birth control system. Now on to its center of origin. The wild pomegranate is found in Transcaucasia and Central Asia, as well as parts of Iran and Turkmenistan, as well as northern India. According to Dr. Levin, there are 3 megacenters of origin for the pomegranate, as well as 5 megacenters: the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Asian, the American, and South African centers. These origin points make up the origin and genetic base of the pomegranate. The primary origin, which is the Middle Eastern megacenter, occupies the areas of Iran and Afghanistan. The secondary centers of origin, or the second megacenter, would be the areas of the Mediterranean and East Asian. It is from these areas that pomegranates spread from east to west. The third center of origin took a lot longer to form, and the forms found in these groups are non-uniform and have a lot of different variation. Most of the variation that was bred primarily occurred near the center of origin where the wild species dwell. And by the 13th century, the Arabs described and classified all local varieties of pomegranates grown in Arabia and Mesopotamia. This process happened in all other areas where they were domesticated. They had also found that in Afghanistan, there are large seedless varieties of pomegranate. In Uzbekistan, the most frost-hardy variants of pomegranate are grown. The best varieties of pomegranate are considered to be the ones of Central Asian origin, although the Mediterranean variants played a major role in pomegranate breeding. Central Asian varieties. The oldest cultivar of American pomegranate is called Wonderful. These were derived from variants of Florida pomegranate, which were derived from the Mediterranean region. In Transcaucasia, the wild and domesticated forms of pomegranate still interbreed, and can be considered a secondary gene pool for the origins of pomegranate. Now on to the domestication of pomegranates. It is estimated that the domestication process of pomegranate started in the Neolithic era, sometime between 10,000 BP and 12,000 BP in the Fertile Crescent. These selections will be based off of fruit size, sugar, acid content, resistant to biotic and abiotic stresses, yield, keeping quality, seed hardness, etc., etc. With the exception of grapes and figs, most fruit crops in the area of the Fertile Crescent were domesticated within the last 5,000 years or so. How fast this plant spread can be estimated by archaeological evidence. Fossilized remnants of pomegranate peel and pits have been found and dated to the early Bronze Age in Jericho and Arad. Likewise, the remains of Punica species have been found in Nimrod during similar time frames. By the Middle Ages, the pomegranate grew throughout the Levant and appeared in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. Many wild groves of pomegranate can still be found thriving at the bottom of gorges throughout the Mediterranean and Central Asian region. This concludes our video on pomegranate domestication. Thank you for watching. Peace out. Hello and welcome to Agri History Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication of sorghum bicolor, better known as sorghum. This crop is a key staple in many ancient Holocene and Neolithic diets, and it's also a mainstay in many African countries. And to that end, there's been a lot of speculation on the origins and domestication of the species. In this episode, we'll cover the origins, domestication, and history of this crop. We will first start with the archaeological history of the species, using a research paper written by Frank Witchell, an independent researcher in 24th Street, Arlington, Virginia, and published in Current Anthropology 2017. This paper utilized pottery remnants as well as grain remnants to showcase the history of this crop. Let's begin. Various sites in the Near East and Eastern Asia have found that sorghum was cultivated in a pre-domesticated form for approximately 2,500 years to 3,500 years, and as such, the earliest forms of sorghum may have come into India by 2000 or 1700 BC. In its domesticated form, sorghum is found in Neolithic areas in Sudan that date between 5000 BC and 3000 BC, and further digs in the Kassala region have shown signs of grain threshing that date to approximately the 4th millennium BC, between 4000 BC and 3001 BC. They've also found ancient samples of sorghum in its domesticated form that date between 3500 BC and 3000 BC in another African region called Kashem el-Gherba. As such, the pre-domesticated forms of cultivated sorghum were likely from Africa, not India. And since domesticated sorghum has been dated to between 2000 and 7000 BC, it is very possible that the idea of a fully domesticated form of sorghum arriving in India is more probable. As such, the evidence seems to suggest an eastern Sudan origin of sorghum, which spread to India and other areas around the world. Now let's talk about the trade routes that were used to spread sorghum to other areas in the world. Now let's talk about the genetics and dissemination of the species. Based on current archaeological evidence, the domesticated form of sorghum bicolor is Sorghum bicolor subspecies verticillifolium, and there seems to be evidence of heavy selection for smaller grains, much like millets. Another key change that happened in sorghum domestication is, like in all grains, they lost the ability to seed shatter. They also lost the ability to go dormant, although sorghum still relies on cross-pollination, far more than most other crops domesticated in that same area of grain origin. The path of dissemination of sorghum happened as the different tribes in what is now known as Sudan began merging into larger and larger groups. This happened with different local groups of sorghum as well. The merged form of all these populations of domesticated sorghum would be called a Butama group. The likely route of the spread of sorghum is it spread via the Sahelian region, which would allow sorghum to reach a region called the Wadi Hawar, which I may be mispronouncing quite heavily. That region is closely connected to the Nile River, and from there it would spread to the rest of Africa and parts of the Middle East. From there, maritime trade via the Arabian and Red Seas would have allowed for trade between East Asia and India and the rest of Africa. These trade routes have been proposed to be the origin of African cultivars of the Chinese species known as broomcorn millet, and the origin of African crops being grown in China, such as hyacinth bean. As such, this two-way trade may be the origin of Indian cultivars of sorghum. Now let's talk about some land races. Now let's discuss some of the many land races of sorghum. There are 5 distinct races of domesticated sorghum: the bicolor form, the Guinea form, the caudatum form, the Kafir form, and the Dura form. The most primitive form is the bicolor form. The most recently developed version of sorghum is the Dura form, which was bred by crossbreeding into another subspecies of sorghum bicolor called Aethiopicum. Others speculate that it may have been bred from bicolor strains that came to India. The Kafir race was bred from the bicolor race, with some crossbreeding back into sorghum's wild strain. This breed is primarily found in eastern and southern Africa, and is used to make a beer called Kafir. Hopefully I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. If I'm not, please let me know. The caudatum strain was bred directly from the bicolor strain, likely without any other associations. And finally, the Guinea strain was bred from the bicolor, with possible crossbreeding with the wild subspecies Arendinacum. The caudatum strains are found mostly in East Nigeria to eastern Sudan, and the Guinea form is found mostly in West Africa. Now that the African land races are discussed, let's talk about some of the East Asian ones. This concludes our video on sorghum domestication. Thank you for watching and stay lit fam. Hello and welcome to Agri History Tropical Edition. In this episode, we'll cover the domestication and origins of sugarcane. Multiple species of sugarcane are used in sugarcane production. 3 predominant species are commonly used. These species include Saccharum officinalis, which is the most common form of sugarcane cultivated and domesticated. Today's cultivars of sugarcane are hybrids made using the species. The other species is called Saccharum sinensis, which itself is a hybrid between Saccharum officinalis and Saccharum spontaneum. This species was domesticated in the Papua New Guinea area and further improved by the Chinese. And the third major species would be Saccharum barberi, which was domesticated shortly after the introduction of Saccharum officinalis in India. These 3 species will respectively be called S1, S2, and S3 for brevity's sake. Sugarcanes, generally speaking, are large perennial tropical/subtropical grasses that are harvested for their sweet liquid, which is used to make sugar. In terms of tonnage produced of sugar, sugarcane is number 1. In terms of how many calories are consumed that are made of sugarcane, it ranks number 3. Now on to the origins of sugarcane, specifically the S1 species. S1 has a natural range all across Southeast Asia, which includes the Malaysian archipelago, New Guinea, and India, as well as several island groups in the Melanesia area. Current evidence, both archaeological and genetic, indicates that the S1 species had its origins in the New Guinea region and was probably domesticated from the wild species Saccharum robustum. There's also been research going on to see if any other species in that area contributed to its genome, and it was shown that our S1 cultivars, which are also known as noble cultivars of sugarcane, are actually complex hybrids of S1, S2, S3, as well as a few wild species like Saccharum spontaneum and Saccharum robustum. But I digress. It is likely that the S1 species, after being domesticated, spread to the other regions of the world, and it's likely that this species became a base parent for a parent species for the S2 and S3 species, which we'll cover next. The sugar canes commonly grown in North India and China are the S2 and S3 species. Based on current genetic evidence, which we'll cover a little bit later on, it is likely that both species were derived from crossbreeding between S1 and Saccharum spontaneum. This likely will have happened around 1000 BCE. As of right now, the S2 and S3 species are only used in collections and breeding programs. The first hypothesis of these origins are the S1 species independently crossbred with Saccharum spontaneum in two different areas, China and India, and these independent hybridizations would become their own species in time. The genetic evidence shows that between 61% to 66% of the DNA in the S2 and S3 species comes from the S1 species, and the rest comes from Saccharum spontaneum, and this remains constant for both species, so it's likely that there is one initial center of origin for these species, and once the hybridization is finished, geographic separation and mutations that happen over time would cause these populations to diverge from each other and become the two species we know today. Now on to the breeding history of sugarcane. Now on to the history of sugarcane breeding. Sugarcane was cultivated and bred through open pollination throughout most of history. And as sugarcane moved from country to country, it crossbred with native species, oftentimes creating new variations, as well as the S2 and S3 species. The quote-unquote noble forms of sugarcane discovered by Linnaeus were collected, and the most common type grown in the New World was the Indian cultivar Creole. This replaced the previous cultivar Otaheite in 1793. The S1 cultivars, or the officialis cultivars from the Pacific Islands, replaced the less productive Indian varieties in the New World, and for over a century they were the major source of sugar in the New World. Unfortunately, these noble varieties were also susceptible to various diseases, and those were later replaced by new hybrids from emerging sugarcane breeding programs. The first breeding program started in Java and Barbados in 1888, after the discovery that sugarcane can produce viable seed. And as mentioned before, these days, most cultivars of sugarcane are complex hybrids between many different species to get what the people call noble traits, which is to say the traits of the S1 species. They often do interspecific hybridization, i.e. crossbreeding between two different species and then back crossing into the S1 species, until only the resistance traits remain. This process started in the early 1900s. Afterwards, from the early 1930s onwards, most hybrids are crossbreeds between nobilized canes, which is to say, the results of all that backcrossing. So the future hybrids that were bred for sugarcane production were all developed from those cultivars of S1, with a little bit of DNA from a wild parent integrated into it. Well, that covers everything. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the two-part final for Agri History Tropical Edition. Stay lit, fam. Hello and welcome to Agri History Tropical Edition. This will be the final episode of Agri History Tropical Edition. In this episode, you'll cover 3 spices in Asia, their domestication and history. This includes ginger, cardamom, and saffron, alongside 2 spices from South America, allspice and paprika. We will start with ginger. Ginger had its origins in the Indo-Malayan region and is now widely distributed across many countries as a spice and a medicinal plant. Merchants took ginger from India to the Mediterranean in the 1st century CE, and the Arabs introduced ginger to West Africa and the Pacific Islands in the 13th century CE. Many of these tropical countries now grow ginger as a cash crop, with India being the largest producer of ginger at 7,500 metric tons during the 2006-2007 time period. There are several different strains of ginger. Cochin ginger and Wyandan ginger are cultivated in India. Chinese ginger is cultivated in China. Budrum Gold is cultivated in Australia, and Jamaican ginger is cultivated in Jamaica. The Chinese, Tibetan, and Arab medicine associations of that ancient era recognized the medicinal value of ginger and used it quite extensively for many centuries. The ancient medicine style called Ayurveda of India was invented approximately 5,000 years ago, and ginger was mentioned in the oldest of these manuscripts. It was also mentioned in the Quran but not in the Bible, which makes sense since ginger was not introduced to the Middle East until much later. Ginger is a rhizome crop, with the highest level of genetic diversity being found in India and China, where the center of origin is located. The geographical distribution, alongside mutations within the asexual propagated species, seems to be responsible for the majority of the genetic diversity of ginger. Although the crop is sterile, the cuttings produced by people for propagation purposes have highly mutagenic qualities, allowing for a decent amount of genetic diversity within cultivars. In the ancient Ayurvedic medicine, ginger was used to alleviate morning sickness and motion sickness. Ginger was mixed with different types of pepper, such as black pepper and a closely related species, to make a medicine called trikaku, which apparently relieved flatulence. Insert fart joke here. It was also used in the medications of ancient times for respiratory disorders and fevers. Now, once again, this is a history channel, not a medicine channel. If you have a sickness, go see a doctor. Now onto cardamom. Cardamom is another species in the ginger family. The use of cardamom dates back to the 2nd century BC. The wild form of the species is pollinated by solitary bees, while the domesticated form is pollinated by social bees, due to being grown in areas where solitary bees are not found in high numbers. As a result, the domestication of cardamom caused a change in the flower shape. In wild populations of cardamom, flowering began in mid-April and continued up to mid-September, with a peak in June or July. Similar to many other species found in that forest area, the flowers of the wild form tend to grow horizontally on the ground, becoming covered in leaf litter. Domesticated cardamom produces a lot more flowers, 6,751 flowers to be precise, and the wild one is estimated to be a mere 2,573 flowers. Other changes in the flower behavior include an increase in the length of the labium and corolla tube of the flowers, as well as the amount of nectar and sugar in the flowers. This occurred after domestication. In terms of vegetative changes, there's an increase in all vegetative parts of cardamom when domesticated, which makes sense considering that the vegetative part, specifically the rhizome, is what is used for the spice. Although there are no reproductive barriers between the wild and domesticated forms, in practice, cross-pollination doesn't happen due to the fact that they have two different pollinators that they attract. The domestication of cardamom seems to be relatively recent, and this cultivated form of the species is only 200 years old. As such, future researchers may use this species to discuss and learn about domestication syndrome. Now on to saffron. Now on to saffron. Saffron is a very expensive spice that often has a price tag that goes up to 30,000 euros per kilogram and is the most expensive spice in the world. The species comes from crocus saffron that is found in Kashmir, India, as well as Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. This species thrives in soils that cannot be utilized for agriculture, and in times gone by it was used as a painkiller for women in childbirth, as well as alcohol addictions and rheumatism. A researcher known as Dr. Thomas Smith learned that the saffron crocus is a sterile triploid species that cannot be bred. This species formed through crossbreeding of tetraploid and diploid strains of Crocus cartwhitianus, a species found in Greece. This species has been cultivated for 3,500 years and is the mainstay for many farmers in Mediterranean countries. With this new knowledge, it is possible to rebreed saffron back into existence through crossbreeding, and as such, make new cultivars. Next, you'll cover the origins and history of paprika. Paprika is a spice made by grinding up the dried fruit of different strains of hot pepper and sweet pepper. The taste, heat, and flavor varies from strain to strain that's used. This spice was made originally in southern Mexico and Central America. It was also found in the Antilles Islands. It was used both as a healing medicine as well as a seasoning for food. It is said that Christopher Columbus discovered and introduced this spice to Europe. Ever since it was brought to the New World, it was spread throughout Europe, including Hungary, where it became a staple food for many Hungarian dishes. It is the Hungarians that named the spice paprika. This spice was not introduced to Western Europe and the rest of the Western world until the mid-1900s. Zoos currently use the spice as well as a seasoning for flamingo food in order to maintain the pink pigmentation of this bird. In current year, Hungary, Spain, good chunks of South America and the Mediterranean, as well as India and California, are all major producers of paprika. Now on to our last spice you'll cover for this. Let's talk about the history of allspice. Pimenta dioica is a scientific name for allspice, which is named so because it has the flavor of both nutmeg, clove, and cinnamon within it. The Mayan natives utilized this plant for embalming purposes in ancient times. Later on in 1492, during his first visit to North America, he mistook allspice berries for the kernels of peppercorn when he first went to South America. For this reason, the Spaniards called allspice pimenta, the Spanish word for black pepper. This also became the genus epithet of the species. Allspice reached England in 1601, and Philip Miller, famed for his Garner Dictionary, grew it in his indoor stove-heated greenhouse in the 1730s. The species epithet, dioica, came from the fact that this plant had male and female flowers. The requirement for cross-pollination may partially explain why allspice never expanded beyond the South American areas. In the 17th to 19th centuries, the berries were often used for preservatives for meats during long voyages, and in Scandinavia, allspice is a common preservative for fish. In current year, whenever you buy a 5-pepper blend, allspice is one of those quote-unquote peppers, and allspice is currently the only major spice where the commercial production is confined to the Western Hemisphere. It is grown extensively in Jamaica, where it has been grown since the 16th century and continues to dominate world production. Well, that's about everything. Stay lit, fam.